Abject Objection. Term used by Julia Kristeva in Powers of Horror, 1980, as an attempt to undo the binary logic of much psychoanalytic thought, where the concepts of desiring, subject and object of desire, often represent a codependent opposition. In order to understand Kristeva's point, it is necessary that we recognize subject and object not only as opposed positions or two halves of a logical model, but also as supposedly discrete and complete identities in and of themselves. Each term is accorded its own self-sufficient meaning with definable boundaries. Such boundaries are the psychic limits by which the self separates itself from its other within the psychoanalytic framework of Kristeva's text. Another way of positing the subject-object dyad would be to comprehend it in terms of self-other. The abject, says Kristeva, is neither subject nor object. Instead, it opposes the ego by drawing me to the place where meaning collapses. While the subject-object structure makes logical meaning possible, but the abject is an uncanny effect of horror, threatening the logical certainty of either the subject-object or self-not self-binary. Abjection is thus the psychic experience of a slip page across the boundaries of the self, and with that a partial erasure of the borders of the psyche which define the ego. Absolutely essential to all cultures, the abject is, amongst other things, the fluid locus of forbidden desires and ideas, whose radical exclusion is the basis of cultural development. Absence-presence. Example of binary opposition, whereby, according to structuralist linguistics and, subsequently, structuralist critical analysis, neither term nor, in fact, the concept articulated by such a term, generates its meaning without implicit acknowledgement of its opposite term, and the necessary implication of one in the other. Jacques Lacan draws on the linguistic work of Roman Jacobson to explore the dynamic of absence-presence in the symbolic order. Jacques Derrida explores the interanimating relationship between the two terms in relation to the privilege in Western thought given to voice as guarantor of presence over the absence and implications of death, signaled in any act of writing. When Derrida remarks that difference is recognized as the obliterated origin of absence and presence, he demonstrates how binarisms are not composed of discrete, separable identities, but are only capable of articulation through their invisible fundamental interconnectedness. Abstraction. Applied to the fine arts, the term refers to the abandonment of representational practices, with a concomitant emphasis on the part of artists on form and color for their own sake. Absurdism. French novelist and philosopher Albert Camus first suggested a philosophy of the absurd, and subsequently his work has come to be regarded as an absurdist expression concerning matters of politics and ethics. The term was taken up specifically with regard to theater, and the phrase theater of the absurd is widely used in criticism. In Europe, chief practitioners of this perceived form of theater were Ionesco, Foe and Beckett. Occasionally Harold Pinter has been included under such a rubric. Conventionally, theater of the absurd involves presentation of the futility of human action or behavior, and the anguish this causes in a meaningless world, rational explanation being unequal to providing purpose. Actant. The term is used in the semiotic work of A.J. Gramus, referring to fundamental actions and character types. According to Gramus, actants exist at the level of action. Characters function as actants when they question the nature of subjectivity. Aesthetic theory. From Greek aesthetikos, meaning perceptible to the senses, aesthetic approaches to literature are ones which concern themselves primarily with the work's beauty and form, rather than with extra-textual issues such as politics or context. Aesthetics, which involves the exploration of beauty in nature in literature and the fine arts, involves two theoretical approaches. 1. The philosophical study of the nature and definition of beauty, and 2. The psychological examination of the perceptions, origins and performative effects of beauty. Etiology. From Greek words aetia meaning cause, and logos, meaning rational discourse, etiology is the philosophical or scientific pursuit of laws of cause and effect. Affective fallacy. Term coined by W. K. Wimsatt and M. C. Beardsley in The Verbal Icon, 1954, which identifies the mistaken analysis of a text in terms of its emotional or affective results, thereby misunderstanding the difference between what a text is and what it does. Aga Saga. Largely derisive term, referring to novels such as those by Joanna Trollope and others of a similar kind, usually set in the home counties. Aga is a proprietary name for a brand of stove that burns solid fuel, gas or oil. The name is an acronym for the original Swedish manufacturers, the Swedish Gas Accumulator Company. The term functions not only in a somewhat pejorative fashion, but also as anecdote, signifying novels concerned with the largely domestic and occasionally erotic lives of upper-middle-class incomers in now gentrified rural communities, the circles of their friends and acquaintances, and the minor intrigues arising from out of such societies. Agency. Literally activeness, more usually used to suggest one's ability to act on the world on one's own behalf, or the extent to which one is empowered to act by the various ideological frameworks within which one operates. Agitprop. Originally a neologism in Russian, combining notions of agitation and propaganda, the term was given to a department of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party. Subsequently, the term has come to define any such activities by groups or individuals, which activities are aimed at the production of political unrest and the dissemination of political propaganda. Alienation. In Marxist theories, alienation is the experience of being distanced or estranged from the products of one's labor, and by extension from one's own sense of self, because of the effects of capitalism. Alienation Effect. Loose translation of the German Befremdungseffekt, which might somewhat more accurately be translated as estrangement effect. The term was first employed by German playwright Bertolt Brecht. He sought to distance and estrange his audiences from his plays by means of an ensemble of devices: projection, banners and signs, exaggerated gestures, voices and performances on the part of the actors, and the abandonment of naturalistic behavior and stage sets in general, in order to prohibit humanist empathy or identification with characters or situations in the plays. The purpose was to engage the audience critically, intellectually and ideologically, suspending feeling and inviting judgment, and to reveal the historical and material dimensions of human actions. Allegory. A literary mode involving extended narratives that produce secondary meanings regarding the story that exists on the surface, otherwise, a form of indirect representation, perhaps best summarized as analogical rather than mimetic. Allegory often functions as a delimiting force because it limits the possible spheres of interpretation to its primary analogy. Characters in allegorical works frequently serve as metaphors for abstract ideas. Alterity. Condition of otherness in critical and philosophical discourse to signal a state of being apprehended as absolutely, radically other. Emmanuel Levinas addresses the absolute exteriority of alterity, as opposed to the binary, dialectic or reciprocal structure implied in the idea of the other. For Levinas, the face of the other is the concrete figure for alterity. My sense of self is interrupted in my encounter with the face of the other, and thus the self, the I as Levinas puts it, knows itself no longer in its self-sameness, but in its own alterity, in coming face to face with the face of the other. Ambiguity. The condition of an utterance having more than one meaning, thereby producing uncertainty. The term is given detailed attention by William Empson in his 7 Types of Ambiguity, 1930, whose analysis denotes the richness and variety of verbal speech. Empson's conception of ambiguity includes 7 categories. 1. A given word or syntax can connote several effective meanings at once. 2. Two or more meanings may comprise a writer's single intended meaning. 3. A pun can offer 2 simultaneous ideas. 4. A writer can employ different meanings in order to establish a clear, albeit complicated state of mind. 5. An image may exist halfway between 2 ideas. 6. Readers may be forced to concoct their own interpretations when confronted with contradictory statements by the writer. And 7. 2 contradictory meanings may signal an intellectual division in the writer's state of mind. Ambivalence. Conventionally, the term signals powerful mutually contradictory feelings concerning a particular subject or the uncertainty arising from such an unresolved state. Employed in particular strands of post-colonial critical discourse and developed specifically from the work of Homi K. Bhabha, ambivalence in this context signifies the condition produced through the discourse of mimicry, whereby in the process of imposing on the colonial subject the desire to render that subject the same as the colonizer, for example, through the colonizer's language, there is produced, says Bhabha, a difference, slippage or excess. Thus, the colonial other is produced as almost, but not quite, the same, thereby producing disquiet in the colonialist, and thus a renewal of the fear of the other. Anaclysis. More conventionally presented as adjective, anaclitic or in the phrase anaclitic type, originally found in Freud, the concept refers to a personality type that fixes another person as its love object, but the fixation is governed by a more primal need, such as hunger. Anaclysis thus refers to a form of libidinal displacement by the subject. Analogy. From the Greek ana, according to, and logos, rational discourse. An analogy is a comparison made between one word, object, story or concept, and another for purposes of comparison and explanation. Analytical criticism. Type of criticism which assumes the text or other work of art as an organic or autonomous whole, the meaning of which can be discerned without reference to features supposedly external to the text, for example context, history, ideology, through close consideration of its various features and their formal relationships within the work. Anamorphosis. From the Greek meaning transformation, the term defines distorted projection effects in works of art, applied to particular objects. When viewed from a conventional perspective, the particular object is unintelligible, it makes no sense within the representational image as a whole. When viewed from a different perspective, the image assumes proper proportions, and its identity becomes intelligible. Perhaps the most famous example of an anamorphic object occurs in Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors, what appears to be a yellowish or ivory-colored smear across the floor of the room in which the ambassadors stand, when viewed from one side is revealed as a skull, and thus understood symbolically as a memento mori, a reminder of human mortality. Anaphora. From the Greek meaning to carry back, this is a rhetorical device whereby a phrase or word is repeated in successive clauses. Alternatively, anaphora is a grammatical term indicating a word that supplements a preceding word or group of words, for example, the use of he or she following the initial use of the proper name. Anastomosis. Originally a biological term indicating interconnection between blood vessels, but given a literary application by J. Hillis Miller, who points out a contradiction within the etymology and definition of anastomosis. It suggests an intercommunication between, on the one hand, two vessels and, on the other, two channels. Furthermore, the figure of anastomosis is doubly contradictory, in that it figures, as Miller puts it, both container and thing contained. As preface to a lengthy critical analysis of Goethe's elective affinities, Miller examines James Joyce's own use of the word. Joyce employs the term 3 times, once in Ulysses and twice in Finnegan's Wake. As Miller shows, anastomosis for Joyce marks 1. The interconnection between past, present, and future. 2. The interconnection of each person to all the previous generations back to Adam and Eve. 3. The intercommunication of sexual intercourse. And 4. The intercommunication imagined in the passing of the genetic message on to future generations. Androgyny. A perceived or projected ambiguity or indeterminacy with regard to a person's gender or sexual identity. To be androgynous is, on the one hand, to have characteristics of both male and female. In mythological narratives or paintings based on myth or allegory, this can be represented through the appearance of both male and female physical attributes, or simply in a facial physiognomy, whereby it is impossible to tell whether one is looking at a man or a woman, while to the eye there is intimation of both. On the other hand, to be androgynous is to appear as neither specifically masculine or feminine, according to a specific culture's dominant models, constructions, or discourses pertaining either to masculinity or femininity. The condition of androgyny is not simply governed by perception or the analytical judgment of an audience. It can be staged or performed strategically so as to disrupt or obscure, or otherwise draw attention to the constricting aspect of societally normative gender roles. Angry young man. The phrase was first used in 1956, largely by journalists, following the premiere of John Osborne's play Look Back in Anger. Subsequently adopted by critics, the phrase rapidly passed into a broader use to define both rebellious, often working-class male characters in plays and novels, to which the phrase kitchen sink drama was also applied, and also novelists such as Alan Sillitoe and playwrights such as Osborne, who were either from working-class backgrounds or who wrote about working-class themes, or what the Times Literary Supplement described in 1957, somewhat pompously, as proletarian artistry. Perhaps somewhat misunderstood and defined retrospectively as a movement, it was never this cohesive. The angry young man was also given expression in social realist cinema in England in the early to mid-1960s by filmmakers such as Lindsay Anderson, Tony Richardson and Carol Rees, in documentaries such as We Are the Lammoth Boys, or feature films such as Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, A Kind of Loving, or The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner. Anthropologism. From the Greek anthropos, human, and logos, rational discourse. Anthropology is the science of humanity. By extension, anthropologism is the application of anthropological insights, methods and practices to other fields of intellectual engagement. Anthropomorphism. The transformation of a non-human subject through an analysis which imbues with qualities peculiar to human beings and thereby makes familiar or quasi-human the subject in question. Anti-foundationalism. Term that refers to the rejection of the philosophy of the existence of a single, unified whole, in which everything is ultimately interrelated. Divided into three principal subcategories: sophism, pragmatism and skepticism, anti-foundationalism underscores the notion that knowledge is transient and is commonly derived from personal experience. Anti-intentionalism. A critical position in which the intentions of the author are regarded as immaterial to the interpretation of the work. Anti-materialist. Any critical or theoretical stance which opposes a materialist viewpoint, that is, any stance that refuses the conditions of material life as the basis of its interpretation. Anti-materialism can be mystical or religious, or it can simply be a depoliticized position. Anxiety of influence. Concept developed by Harold Bloom in his book of the same name. Bloom's phrase signals a theory of poetic influence and indebtedness. Specifically, Bloom's theory addresses the way in which the work of major, or what Bloom calls strong, poets persists as an influence on poets of later ages, and how later poets, in developing and struggling with their strong precursors, effectively misread their influences so as to produce their own strong poetry. The process of struggling with one's major influences, Bloom argues, involves inescapable anxieties of indebtednesses. Aporia Operatic. Deriving from the Greek for unpassable path or impasse, aporia has been used by Jacques Derrida to describe the effects of difference. The aporetic and the experience of its excess is figured in the undecidable in meaning, irreducible to a limited semantic horizon. Language announces its radical undecidability, whereby, contrary to the limits of logic, a concept is shown to be identifiable as being disturbed internally, on the one hand, as neither this nor that, while, on the other hand, as both this and that. Archaeology. Term used by Michel Foucault, which indicates a mode of analysis or methodology of discursive formations and statements without assigning or seeking origins in the human sciences, for example psychiatry, political economy. For Foucault, such discursive strands or strata, those subject-specific languages embedded in a particular culture, distinguish the human sciences from any pure scientificity, in that they invoke ideologies, beliefs and interests beyond any statement of disinterested data. Arche-ecriture. From the Greek, arch means a founding, original or governing, controlling principle. Jacques Derrida coins the term, translatable as arche or arch writing, to indicate how the very idea of an origin or founding principle is not self-sufficient, full or undifferentiated, but, at its origin, is always already traced by the work of difference or writing, in order for it to be articulated. Sense or meaning is never originary or fully present, but always spaced and structured temporally. Archetype. Chiefly in the psychoanalytic theory of Carl Jung and the literary criticism of Northrop Frye, archetypes are those pervasive or supposedly universal symbols that recur from culture to culture and trench historically. For Jung, the archetype is a primordial image that recurs throughout human civilization in various forms, always referring back to the original type. For Frye, archetypes are symbols that recur recognizably from one literary text to another and across otherwise disparate literary forms, genres and cultures. Architectonic. Referring to construction or structure and, as Aristotle employs it, having control over structure, the term is used critically as addressing the systematization of knowledge. Archive. Originally either a public office or building in which documents were stored, or the historical documents making up an archive is a form of public or social memory. The term also operates as a verb to indicate the activity of archiving, of preserving documents, records and so on. In computing terms, archiving refers to the hierarchical storing of infrequently used files or documents. Generally, archiving refers to the storing of any data, whether materially or virtually. In Archive Fever, Jacques Derrida offers analysis of the notion of the archive in relation to particular Freudian concepts concerning memory and what Freud perceived as the hierarchical embedding of memories in the conscious and unconscious. Additionally, Derrida speculates on the effects of virtual storage, on the internet, hypertext, and so on the idea of the archive, and the possible transformation or spectralization of the notion of the archive and archiving. Aristotelian. Ideas deriving from the writings of Aristotle, whose Poetics in particular is an early example of literary criticism. The Poetics is an analysis of the elements of tragedy that make one example of the genre more or less successful than another example. His focus is on the structure of the plot, especially as it connects to the moral lesson of the play. He isolates the features that have since come to be known as the unities. The unities of time. The action takes place in one day, place, it takes place in one location, an action, it is concerned with one significant action. The highest shape of the tragic plot in Aristotle's terms was one which focused on elements of reversal in the fortunes of the protagonists, recognitions of moral lessons and catharsis in the audience, whereby the viewer is purged by his or her experience of seeing the action played out. The emphasis is thereby on structure and the audience's moral response to structure. Aura. Providing aesthetic theory with an important critical term, Walter Benjamin's concept of the aura of a work of art is what Benjamin calls the unique phenomenon of distance that is to be found in high cultural forms. The term refers to matters of an artwork's uniqueness and authenticity. While the auratic places an artwork beyond the quotidian, for Benjamin reproductions create a plurality of copies where there was once a unique existence. Benjamin also notes the auratic in natural objects, while insisting, in both the artwork and the natural object, the experience of the auratic as the experience of a falling away, a decaying or disappearance always already in process. The auratic, it should be noted, is not figured nostalgically, even though the artwork's aura appears to be threatened by mechanical reproduction, or, as Samuel Weber more accurately translates it, technological reproducibility, which in principle dissipates the work's uniqueness or singularity. The unique artifact is distanced by its uniqueness in a weave of both space and time. However, Benjamin argues that, though dissipated by modern technologies of reproduction, a work's aura continues to give it authority and mystery. Auteur Theory. Developed as an explanatory notion by contributors to the film studies journal Cahiers du Cinéma, regarding the control the director has over the making of a film, from questions of diegesis, narrative, editing, framing and so on. An auteur for author is a director whose vision is assumed to be recognizable stylistically and rhetorically across a range of films. Thus, arguably, the movies of Woody Allen or Ingmar Bergman have recognizable elements, motifs, concerns, repeated edits, shots and so on which, from film to film, are elements of the filmmaker's signature. Authorship. The notion of authorship refers to the concept of the individual who employs his or her imaginative and intellectual powers in the construction of a given literary text. While, historically, concepts of authorship have been tied to the legal status of creative works and the rights of the author. In the post-structuralist era, the idea of authorship has become dispersed or radically rethought. Many literary theorists, for example, subscribe to the concept of authorship as the product of multiple cultural, historical and social forces that impact the act of textual production. Hence, Roland Barthes announced the death of the author in 1968 in an effort to challenge our existing traditional notions of authorship and textual authority. Authorial intention. The idea that, through the close reading of a literary text, the reader can discern or in some manner gain access to the author's intentions or what the author really means to say. Authority. The power that comes from the assumption of being unique or originary, or the significance invested in the cultural status of an originator or author, from which the word derives, of a given work, the assumption of power invested in signs, practices, laws or discursive practices. Thus, the limits placed on meaning when interpreters turn to the biographies or the known authorial intentions. Autonomy of art. The view that art literature is autonomous, that is, that it has no function beyond itself, that it is politically, socially, economically and personally disengaged, a view of literature favored, implicitly or explicitly by the new critics in the US, and by F.R. Leavis and the other contributors to Scrutiny. Avant-Garde. From the French avant-garde, avant-garde in art or literature means artistic practices that deviate daringly from conventional practice. The art of the new.